From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast which discusses figurative sculpture and figurative sculptors, produced by me, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher living and working in Florence, Italy, an amazing city where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. And today on The Sculptor's Funeral, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take a look at a certain type of sculpture that is sort of new. Or perhaps I should say, we're going to take a look at a way people are using an old form of sculpture in a way which seems to be new. Anyway, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, let me play you a little audio from a recent event that features the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Good evening. We're beginning with breaking news. The U.S. government is bringing criminal charges against Edward Snowden.
Today he came out as the leaker of classified NSA documents.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden.
Edward Snowden.
My name's Ed Snowden. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA.
All right, what we're hearing is audio from a YouTube video that was produced by several artists who worked together to create a piece of sculpture, a bust in honor of the infamous NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. The video goes on to describe why they did what they did, but first, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with exactly what they did, here's a quick rundown. Early one morning, several artists and assistants covertly placed a colossal-scale portrait bust of NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden onto a section of a Revolutionary War memorial in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, New York. The piece was not commissioned by the park or anyone connected to it. They did not have permission to place it, and no one in authority knew about the work beforehand. The bust of Snowden was placed on a column which forms a small part of the prison ship Martyrs Memorial. In front of the column there's a bronze eagle with its wings spread, and at the base of this column the fugitive artists attached lettering spelling out Snowden's name. And it has to be said that if you didn't know any better, you would think that the new additions to this column had always been a part of the design. The bust and lettering didn't last long, however. Someone in authority quickly found out, and the additions were removed before noon of the same day. However, images and video quickly spread around the internet, and so the Snowden bust, which just a few decades ago would have gone largely unseen and unnoticed by the public, instead went viral. I'll play you a little more of that audio released by these clandestine artists who explain their actions and intentions very clearly.
It's been 2 years since NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden leaked top-secret documents to the media, detailing the most expansive domestic and international spy program ever devised. Despite this huge trove of data, for the most part, the American public has moved on from this story without much consequence. In an effort to refocus the national dialogue about the threats to civil liberties that these leaks uncovered, a group of artists decided to make a bust of Edward Snowden and install it in New York City.
We're used to seeing in our visual vocabulary in society statues, busts, memorials. We chose to pay tribute to Snowden through the medium of a bust because that is one of the visual pieces that society uses as a guidepost to who a hero is.
It took the sculptor nearly 6 months to mold and complete the bust. The artists then had to wait several weeks for the weather to improve before they installed it at the prison ship Martyrs Monument.
It's really not just about the bust, it's about the context, because we feel it's a continuation of a story that was started hundreds of years ago.
In the Revolutionary War, the British Army had these massive prison ships that were eventually sunk. And so these are people that died in part so that our country can have the freedoms that this country was founded on.
If you engage in polite debate, touting your disdain for the way the system is, it kind of just stays at the status quo. Without risk, there really is no reward. We look at this as a gift to the city, but gifts are sometimes not accepted. We've gone to great lengths to make sure that aesthetically, the item that we're placing there is honoring the aesthetics that are already in place. Everything from the width of the shoulders of the statue being the same width as the eagle's wings to the bronze patina finish. Everything has been made so that it feels like a cohesive unit. But we're also installing it in a way that it could be removed without doing permanent damage to the structure.
Now, I'm not bringing all of this up to voice an opinion about Edward Snowden, although of course I do have one. But whether you are a right-wing fascist jackboot who thinks Snowden is a traitor, or a leftist pinko commie who thinks Snowden is a hero, what should be of interest to us all is the nature of this sculpture, and others like it. It's part of a new genre. It's an example of guerrilla art. Art displayed in a public space without the knowledge or approval of the authorities. So we all know what graffiti is, and many of us are familiar with graffiti's evolved cousin, known as street art. The most famous of the street artists, who's known as Banksy, is by now a household name, and an artist who commands both respect and high prices for his work. People may remember Shepard Fairey, the street artist who came up with the now iconic Hope poster for Barack Obama's campaign. In the last 2 or 3 decades, what was once just a bunch of young punks scribbling their names on the side of a subway car with a can of spray paint has evolved into an authentic, global, artistic subculture and an art movement, which I think in the future will be regarded as valid as any other post-classical movement in art, alongside Cubism or abstract expressionism or impressionism. Now, as with all art movements, most street art is pretty mediocre. But then there is the top 5% of work that truly is worth preserving. And although street art, when taken as a whole, doesn't really have a cohesive style or medium, it does have a bit of an ethos. A central tenet of street art is that it wishes to repurpose our shared spaces into a venue of expression and communication of ideas through art. The nemesis of street art is public advertising. Corporations selling everything from hamburgers to healthcare have dominated the public spaces in America and, to a lesser extent, elsewhere in the world. And the notion that a person is forbidden to display creative work publicly unless it is selling something, and unless you pay for that privilege, well, that's anathema to street artists. Advertising is often a target of street art, both as a subject of mockery and satire, but also physically, with advertising on billboards often reappropriated by street artists, by these clandestine artists, to deliver a different and sometimes even contrary message. Much of street art is textually based, like its forerunner, graffiti. But we can also see that when it is graphic, generally it's representational rather than abstract or conceptualist, and often it's figurative. Much of street art isn't as spontaneous and as haphazard as graffiti often is. Some street artists work for months on their ideas and renderings before taking it to the streets. Some works take weeks to complete. I think that generally, aesthetically, its closest cousin is the realm of illustration, and many street artists have in fact studied illustration at university or art school. There's even a bit of an exchange between the world of street art and the traditional / old master emulating atelier movement. In fact, the hosts of the Suggested Donation podcast, Tony Curanai and Edward Minoff, are traditionally trained painters whose first experiences in art were graffiti and street art. By the way, Suggested Donation, that podcast I just mentioned, if you don't know it, it's a podcast for figurative painters based in New York, and it focuses on interviews with some of the top painters in the atelier movement. I'm a regular listener, and I encourage you to give it a listen as well. Now, I'm not going to talk in depth about street art here. There's tons you can find out on the internet if you're interested, but I just wanted to set the stage of our discussion a bit by pointing out that street art truly has developed and blossomed into the most vital and authentic movement in art around the world in the last few decades. And it should be pointed out that the vast majority of street art is two-dimensional rather than sculptural. But work like the clandestine monument to Edward Snowden is certainly a subset of this movement, although it's also a little different. Now I'm going to take a look at the Snowden monument and several other similar works and see if we can't detect an emerging trend in the way figurative sculpture is being brought to the public. So with the Snowden Memorial, we see that an older monument, the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument, was reappropriated and altered for a new purpose. In fact, the anonymous creators of the Snowden bust call the new work the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument 2.0. But what is a prison ship martyr? I had never heard of this monument before, so I looked into it a bit, and it's got a fascinating history. The Prison Ship Martyrs Monument honors over 11,000 American prisoners of war who were captured by British forces during the American Revolution. The prisoners were held aboard prison ships, that is, old ships repurposed as confinement, and anchored in New York Harbor. Conditions aboard the prison ships were so brutal that more American soldiers died in these 16 ships and in other British jails for prisoners of war than in all the battles of the American Revolution combined. So at first glance, it seems that a shrine sacred to the memory of the majority of those who died in the War of the American Revolution is an inappropriate site to be reappropriated for a single person who fled the country and is wanted for arrest. I can see that point of view very clearly. However, I have come to think that it was a rather brilliant choice. To understand why, we need to look at the original monument and its history to see that rather than the Snowden bust being an affront to the memory of these soldiers, it in fact pays homage to it. The history of honoring the collective memory and memorializing these dead prisoners by the United States is a history of apathy and neglect. Let's go back to the Revolutionary War for a moment and trace the path from the war to the monument. Now, during the American Revolution, when a prisoner of war died aboard these ships, the British simply threw the corpses overboard into New York Harbor, off the coast of Brooklyn near Wallabout Bay, which was a very rural part of the outskirts of the city. And in the years after the American Revolution, thousands of these corpses, of these dead prisoners, washed ashore in Wallabout Bay and were left to rot on the beaches. It was a sparsely populated area, and I imagine all the corpses didn't make it a very popular place to visit after that. But the issue was just simply ignored for years. And in 1806, more than 20 years after the end of the war, when the area was being excavated to build the Brooklyn Naval Yard, one witness recorded seeing, quote, skulls and feet, arms and legs sticking out of the crumbling bank in the wildest disorder. The bones were finally gathered up, and a crypt was built to house the remains in Brooklyn, in a place now called Vinegar Hill. But the crypt wasn't a national monument or even a civic one. It was built on land belonging to an interested private citizen and was therefore private property. The land was actually later sold to a survivor of the prison ships, but no public funds were appropriated by anyone for the upkeep of the crypt, and the monument, known only locally, fell into disrepair and neglect. Meanwhile, New York was growing, and the property was deemed too valuable to house a crypt, and so finally, in the 1870s, a century after the American Revolution, a few $1,000s were appropriated for a new mausoleum in Fort Greene Park. It was only later, after a congressional appropriation in 1903, that the mausoleum was enlarged to what it now is, an impressive memorial. The centerpiece of the monument being an enormous Doric column, 150 feet high, topped with an 8-ton bronze funeral urn, complete with an electric eternal flame. All designed by noted architect Stanford White. A staircase inside the enormous column allowed visitors to climb up to the top for what was a breathtaking view of the area. However, since the construction of this final monument, the memorial has suffered from chronic neglect. The problem seems to be that it's not a national monument somehow, but rather owned by the city and cared for with local park funds. At one low point in the monument's short history, the eternal flame had been out for over a decade. The staircase inside the column had been removed, the door to the monument boarded up with plywood, and the crypt itself had been broken into several times, with graffiti covering the walls and other areas of the monument. It's only in the last 15 years that a significant effort to restore the monument has taken place, and now it's actually in quite good condition, and everything is in working order. However, it still hasn't been designated a national memorial, which would ensure its proper upkeep, despite the fact that it's the largest tomb of Revolutionary War dead. And outside of Brooklyn, both the story of the prison ships and the monument to those who died remains almost unknown. I doubt any non-New Yorker listening right now has ever heard of the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial before this whole Snowden incident. So I see a few parallels that can be drawn between the neglect of the memory of these war dead and the apathy from the American public concerning illegal domestic spying, which the authors of the Snowden sculpture wished to address. The entire point of a memorial, any memorial, is to preserve collective memory. The preservation of memory was exactly what the collaborators had in mind, and they've stated their dismay that despite of all the unconstitutional activity that the leaks from Edward Snowden exposed, the public has largely moved on from the story, and no substantial actions have been taken against the NSA. And what is worse, in their mind, is the way collective memory is being shaped by the media. And they're quoted as saying, "There's a media landscape that has painted him as a criminal. You need something theatrical and large to counterbalance the Fox Newsiness of the texture of the conversation out there." In a release statement, they go on to say, "We have updated this monument to highlight those who sacrifice their safety in the fight against modern-day tyrannies. It would be a dishonor to those memorialized here not to laud those who protect the ideals they fought for, as Edward Snowden has by bringing the NSA's Fourth Amendment violating surveillance programs to light. Our goal is to bring a renewed vitality to the space and prompt even more visitors to ponder the sacrifices made for their freedoms. We hope this inspires them to reflect upon the responsibility we all bear to ensure our liberties exist long into the future." So there's another historically interesting aspect of turning the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument into a temporary Snowden monument. The reappropriation of older monuments for newer purpose, of course, is nothing new. That's been going on since ancient times. Pagan temples become Christian churches. Statues of Roman senators have their heads replaced with portraits of subsequent rulers. Older palaces become newer museums, and so on. You can even, in this context, mention a mountain sacred to the Lakota tribe of Native Americans in South Dakota, this mountain known by the Lakota as the Six Grandfathers, being reappropriated as a site sacred to American mythology and hosting the portraits of 4 American presidents and renamed Mount Rushmore. The main difference between all these examples and what happened at the Prison Ships Monument is that the reappropriation was attempted by those not in official or de facto power. Even though the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument 2.0 lasted only a few hours, it raises an interesting topic: the idea of a public monument erected without official knowledge or consent. Are there other examples of this we can look at? Well, I know there are a few out there, but not many other examples of guerrilla public monuments that I can find. Interestingly, they all have different catalysts, different purposes. The Snowden Monument is, at its core, intended to be subversive. It attempts to upend the status quo of complacency in the media and in the public. But another guerrilla monument that I know of had quite different intentions. It was designed actually to reaffirm the status quo. And this monument is known as the Wall Street Bull. This iconic bronze sculpture of a larger-than-life-size charging bull is located in the Wall Street district of New York City, and it's the immediate area's most famous tourist site and on a par with the Statue of Liberty as a recognizable New York sculpture. It's patently an allegory of the bull market, which is what Wall Street commodities traders call a positive, expanding, and profitable stock market, as opposed to a bear market, which would be the opposite. And if you didn't know any better, you would think that due to the Wall Street Bull's size and quality and suitability for its location and its positive message, you would think that it was commissioned by the New York Stock Exchange or the Chamber of Commerce or some other official body. But that's not true at all. It's every bit as clandestine as the Snowden Monument, created and installed without any official patronage, approval, or knowledge. In the early morning hours of January 15th, 1989, a sculptor named Arturo Di Modica arrived out in front of the New York Stock Exchange on Broad Street with a large truck and a crane, and he offloaded his enormous bronze bull right next to a 60-foot Christmas tree that had been set up by the city for the holiday season. Declaring the bull to be a Christmas present to the city, Di Modica hung out next to the bull all that day and passed out flyers which explained and advertised his artwork. Hundreds came out to look at it on its first day, and it was hugely popular from the outset. However, just as with the bust of Edward Snowden, the city seized the work and took it away, although due to the size of the bull it took a little more than a few hours to get rid of it. The outcry from the public was immediate, and many of the objectors to the bull's removal were traders and financial officials who worked in the district. A week after the bull was illegally placed by Arturo de Modica, the bull found a new legal home a few blocks away in Bowling Green Park near Broadway. According to the artist, the charging bull was a response to what has become known as Black Monday, the day of the largest drop in stock market history, which happened 2 years previously in 1987. De Modica says he conceived of his bull as an encouragement to Wall Street. Hard to imagine these days an artist taking pity on those poor financial traders. But this was, of course, back before the financial deregulation which led to the housing bubble and to the self-inflicted wounds to the financial industry which decimated the wealth of many Americans in the last decade. Whatever the spark for the creation of the sculpture, it remains an enduring success, and thousands come to Bowling Green Park every day to take their selfies next to it. The difference between the fates of these two clandestine monuments, one removed permanently and their creators made to pay a fine, and the other, which was celebrated and allowed to become a tourist attraction, well, the difference obviously derives from each statue's position relative to the powers that be. Both works were freely and expressly given to the city as gifts, but one monument is seen as subversive and the other is seen as supportive. So one monument was refused and the other graciously accepted. The city of New York, by the way, does not technically own the charging bull. It's considered to be on loan. As for its sculptor Arturo de Modica, he's found success in selling a few copies of this bull to other cities around the world, and so it seems that his altruism towards the traders of Wall Street has paid dividends. The sculptors behind the Snowden monument have also gotten their bust back, and it comes as no surprise to hear that several galleries, museums, and private clients have already expressed an interest in the work. So, are these clandestine monuments examples of the work of civic-minded artists, or are they gambles on the part of their creators for a little notoriety, PR, and possible future sales? Well, it would be naive not to admit that professional or financial success was a factor behind de Modica's bull. He used the work to advertise himself literally from day one, in addition to repeatedly and successfully suing anyone who uses the images of the bull without his permission, which comes at a price. In the case of the anonymous Snowden sculptors, any possible financial motives remain to be seen. But what can't be denied is that both artists took a large financial risk to see their work through. The Snowden monument cost about $30,000 to design and execute, and the bull cost $360,000, and that's $1989. It's no small sum. Personally, I see absolutely nothing wrong with the idea that Arturo de Modica might have had nothing but financial and commercial gain in mind when creating the bull. De Modica had what has proved to be an excellent idea for a public statue, and he realized his design expertly, and he's been rewarded for his initiative. But imagine what would have been the response to de Modica's work if he approached the relevant city officials of New York with a small model in clay and said, "Hey, City of New York, what you need is a big bull statue in front of the stock exchange." They would have politely thanked him for his time and sent him on his way. This is one of the conundrums of the creation of public art. It's difficult for many to imagine the benefit public art can have without actually having the work in place first. It will always be a bit of a risk. But I imagine that if de Modica threatened to take his statue away today, which legally he can do, I'm positive that the city or someone else would raise the funds to make the bull permanent property of that park, because the benefits to tourism in the area are obvious. It's proven, but de Modica had to prove it first. Maybe this sort of guerrilla public art signals the way forward for public figurative sculpture. In my mind, guerrilla public art solves many of the problems inherent in the way our culture deals with public art patronage. Gone are the days when civic leaders like Lorenzo de' Medici and Louis XIV and Pope Urban VIII, all intelligent and dedicated lovers of art, would just give free rein to the geniuses of their day. Nowadays, when the need for public sculpture is felt, it's placed in the hands of a committee, most members of which have areas of expertise outside the realm of art. You'll have your several members representing the city itself, like the town planner and an engineer or two. You might have some local wealthy busybodies whose only credential is that they've given money towards the project. And you might have the local Parks and Recreation Department represented, and on and on and on, forming a committee of members whose opinions often seem to carry more weight than the artists'. Instead of submitting to the will of civic subcommittees, perhaps we sculptors should take matters into our own hands, find a public site that would benefit from public art, build it, place it, and let the public decide whether your judgment was sound. This is actually an idea that's been kicking around in my head for over a decade now. 15 years ago, I knew I wanted to be a sculptor of public monuments, but I couldn't get around that catch-22 of public art. No committee will give a job to a sculptor with no experience in public art. So how do you gain the experience? I came up with a plan to sculpt a life-size work and place it anonymously like Demotica did with his bull. My hope was that enough people would see it and like it to maybe raise a subscription to buy it, or if they didn't buy it, at least convince the city to leave it in place. And at least then I would have a public work in my resume. I never followed through with my plan, mostly because before I figured out how in the world I could pay to make a life-size bronze on my own dime, I was given my first large commission from a private individual. And after my first large work, others followed a little bit more easily, so I never had to resort to guerrilla monument making. But I still think it's a good idea. 15 years ago, the main stumbling block for the realization of my scheme was money. How could I pay for my own public monument? It just couldn't be done out of my own pocket at the time. It still can't. However, times have changed, and now there exists such a thing as crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, as we all know, is when many people contribute small amounts of money towards a project that otherwise could not find a single large donor. Indiegogo and Kickstarter are two of the most popular online crowdfunding websites, but the idea of crowdfunding itself isn't new with them. The pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, for example, that was funded in the same way, but through newspapers and magazines advertising the call for donations rather than the internet. Back in those days, it was called subscription. The word subscription has fallen out of usage in this context, but if we transpose the word subscription from its Latin roots to more modern equivalents, we get a more familiar term. Subscription literally means underwriting. In other words, paying for, underwriting. Whether it's called subscription, underwriting, or crowdfunding, the idea is the same. And what I really like about the idea of crowdfunding is that a successful campaign justifies the worth of the project you're raising money for. I mean, if I were to design a project that no one gave money to, that might be a good indicator as to whether or not my idea was a good one, or my design was a solid one. I checked out Kickstarter this week, and I found almost 500 art projects that had Kickstarter campaigns, some with needs of a few $100s, and some in need of a few $100,000. Many of these projects won't reach their funding goals, but some will when they appeal to a sufficient number of like-minded people. Next, we're going to look at a public sculpture underway right at the moment, which was successfully fully funded by an Indiegogo campaign. It's exactly the kind of sculpture that would never be funded by public funds, and yet, this sculpture in progress might be one of the most significant monuments created in the United States in this decade. This monument tackles issues at the heart of what it means to live in a free society, and speaks of the freedoms the United States Constitution guarantees to all its citizens, guarantees that some citizens feel have been under attack for far too long. And how better to express these freedoms than by erecting a statue in honor of the Dark Lord Baphomet, satanic ruler of the underworld. We'll hear more about this public sculpture dedicated to the tenets of satanic worship and the intentions behind its creation when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hi everyone, just a reminder that there is still space available for you to join me in a marble carving workshop in the UK in August. I'll be teaching both hand and machine carving techniques, as well as the use of the pointing machine, the centuries-old device that allows a sculptor to copy a plaster cast into marble. And you'll have the chance to do just that. Over the course of the 2-week workshop, you'll copy a plaster cast of the old masters of your choice. In 2 weeks, you can walk away with your own marble copy of the face of Bernini's St. Teresa, or Michelangelo's Dying Captive, or a small-scale torso of the Venus de Milo, and there are many others to choose from besides. The fee for the workshop covers all tools and materials, so you don't have to worry about buying a bunch of tools you might not need or ever use again. And I want to stress that there is no experience necessary for this workshop. You don't even have to be a sculptor to take this course. It's designed for beginners, and all are welcome. Sculpture students, painters, lovers of art, or anyone who has always just wanted to know how it was done. The course starts August 10th and runs to the 22nd, and it's all happening outside of Marlborough in Wiltshire, adjacent to the studios of sculptors Mark Jackson and Charlie Langton, who both have been recently featured on The Sculptor's Funeral. But you have to sign up by the 1st of July. And so to do so, you'll need to go to the website www.thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on the Wiltshire Workshop button, and you'll find all the information you need, as well as the simple application form. But if you have further questions, hey, just email me directly at thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to help you out. That's thesculptorsfuneral@gmail.com. So that's the Wiltshire Workshop starting August 10th, and visit thesculptorsfuneral.com and sign up today. Okay, so far today we've looked at two works of sculpture, both privately funded, yet designed and placed in public view. They were created for different reasons, but both were clandestine. Now let's turn to two other monuments in America that share similar qualities. They're also privately funded, yet meant for public display. But interestingly, neither of these monuments is clandestine. They are both designed to be installed in a public space which has more or less been designated as a monument park, an area of the lawn of the state capitol building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. The latest monument to be erected in this monument park on the grounds of the state capitol has been a monument of the Ten Commandments, the foundation of Judeo-Christian law. It's a big granite slab, and it's inscribed with the Ten Commandments and kind of looks like a big tombstone. But wait a minute, isn't the United States supposed to have a clear separation of church and state? And that in the United States Constitution itself, it is clearly stated that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof? Now, how is placing the tenets of a single religion on the front of the seat of governmental power in Oklahoma not promoting one religion over the others? And didn't the Supreme Court actually rule in 2005 that another monument of the Ten Commandments could not be placed on government property? Well, remember that this Ten Commandments is in a designated monument park, intended to be seen as separate from the state capitol. And besides, no taxpayer funds paid for the monument. It was paid for out of pocket by one citizen of Oklahoma, namely Oklahoma State Representative Mike Ritz. So, yeah, this is a controversial monument, as it narrowly avoids being unconstitutional, although the courts still have yet to decide whether or not it actually is lawful. And the fact that a state representative, in other words, one of the governing members of the state of Oklahoma, has placed the monument, well, that's another hotly contested point. There are many people who have no problem with this monument, and many people who have a big problem with this monument. This monument perhaps follows the letter of the law set in the Constitution, but not the spirit of the law. However, as a member of the Oklahoma Capitol Preservation Commission said in an interview, quote, "Individuals and groups are free to apply to place a monument or statue or artwork." So maybe it's not so much that placing the Ten Commandments is singling out a single religion. It's just that someone of Judeo-Christian belief got their monument in first. Someone had to be first, right? I mean, others of other faiths are welcome to apply, and everyone is free and equal. And it turns out at least one other religious group has applied to place a monument. A group known as the Satanic Temple has gone through the application process and is at this moment constructing a bronze figurative sculpture in honor of the satanic lord Baphomet, enthroned on his evil satanic throne, right hand raised in benediction, and accompanied by two smiling children at his side. A crowdfunding campaign was started to raise the money. The campaign was successful beyond what the Satanic Temple was hoping for, and a New York sculptor and Grand Central Academy alumnus, Mark Porter, was hired to model the monument. Now, we don't have to pretend we don't know what's going on here. The Satanic Temple is putting up this monument to make a point about freedom of religion, and they say so themselves, and additionally say that if the monument of the Ten Commandments were removed, they will withdraw their application for the placing of their monument. They are more interested in promoting the separation of church and state than in promoting Satan. In fact, the members of the Satanic Temple don't actually believe in Satan. Knowing nothing about Satanism, I checked out their website, and here's a quick quote from their website. "It is the position of the Satanic Temple that religion can and should be divorced from superstition. As such, we do not promote a belief in a personal Satan. To embrace the name Satan is to embrace rational inquiry, removed from supernaturalism and archaic, tradition-based superstitions. The Satanist should actively work to hone critical thinking and exercise reasonable agnosticism in all things. Satan is symbolic of the eternal rebel in opposition to arbitrary authority, forever defending personal sovereignty even in the face of insurmountable odds. Satan is an icon for the unbowed will of the unsilenced inquirer, the heretic who questions sacred laws and rejects all tyrannical impositions. Ours is the literary Satan, best exemplified by Milton and the romantic Satanists from Blake to Shelley to Anatole France." Well, so there you go. These guys seem more like rational-minded provocateurs rather than devil worshippers. The statue of Satan's minion, Baphomet, is just one of several instances where this satanic temple has defended the First Amendment, which protects freedom of religion, against the occasional zealous Christian who tries to mingle Christianity and government a little too much. This includes their fighting the distribution of religious pamphlets and materials in state-run schools, opposing members of government organizations who try to incorporate prayer into official business and meetings, and so on. They do it in a lawful way, ironically exploiting the same legal loopholes that Christian groups do. They also do a lot of work towards the protection of children from abuse. For worshippers of the Lord of the Bottomless Pit, they're pretty decent people. But regardless of what you think of Satanists, the key point here to remember is that the Satanic Temple was only the catalyst for the monument. It was paid for by hundreds of donors through crowdfunding. And the money certainly came from many people who would not ever identify themselves as Satan's spawn. I think the public monument proposal would appeal to anyone with a deep concern for freedom of religion in the public sphere, a sense of humor, and a little expendable cash. But anyway, let's get away from the religious and political issues here, and back to what this whole kerfuffle signifies for us sculptors, and what it signifies for public art. Again, let's look at this in a historical context. It's clear from the several examples I've talked about today that there is a trend towards a new type of public art, the likes of which have not been seen before. Privately funded, privately realized public sculpture. I'm sure there are many more examples of this, but I wonder if I could find any examples at all previous to the 20th century. And the novelty of this work just isn't in who's paying for it, or whether it has official approval. The novelty is in the new purposes and avenues of expression public monuments are being used for. Both the content and the intention of these works are what is truly novel. Historically, you would be hard-pressed to find a public monument that wasn't either a commemoration of a historic event or person, or a monument dedicated to the dominant power's cultural ideals. Until now, public monuments meant official monuments, expressions of the will of whatever mechanism held power. Maybe these new monuments are better described as populist monuments rather than public ones. These new populist monuments express ideas coming from parts of society and culture usually not represented in monument form. They can be used to express discontent, like Snowden's monument. They can be used to address cultural and political issues head-on, inspire intelligent debate, and even highlight weaknesses in the law, like the Baphomet monument does. Or they simply can be inspired, creative works made by individuals who can give perfect expression to the zeitgeist of their culture, like the Wall Street Bull. I'm sure populist monuments will have other uses I cannot imagine, but I think we're only going to see more and more of this type of work. I'm also sure that the impulse to erect monuments like this, on a sculptor's own terms, I'm sure that impulse has been around for as long as public sculpture has. But it's really only now that it's become feasible. Funding has been, and always will remain, a crucial issue in an art whose materials are carved stone and cast metals on a large scale. But crowdfunding seems to address that need, as well as provide a filter of sorts for ideas and proposals that might not be worth the effort. Now add this to the lowering costs and increasing versatility of 3D printing, and it's easy to imagine a new dawn for public sculpture. And as if to prove this point, just last week it was announced that the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial 2.0, that is, the bust of Snowden atop the column, complete with the eagle and the lettering, well, that is all freely available as a three-dimensional print file. You can order a printed copy online from Sketchfab, a 3D printing company, or anyone with their own 3D printer can just download and print their own edition of this memorial in any scale. It's impossible to know where all these developments are headed, but it's tempting to conclude that we're on the verge of a possible revolution in public sculpture. A revolution in medium, in intention, in content, and most promisingly, in a creator's ability to reach their public. I'll leave the last word on this to the anonymous voice, which in recent weeks has been heard all around the world.
If this thing gets taken down right away, it certainly will be disappointment, but we think it'll be worth it thanks to the internet. The fact that a risk was taken, the fact that an image comes out of that event that can be passed around can never be undone. So you can rip the statue out, but you can't erase the fact that it happened and that people are sharing it and that could inspire people to speak up in their own creative ways.
Well, all right. I want to thank you all for listening. Don't forget, you can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral at thesculptorsfuneral.com. You can view images of works discussed in each episode in the image galleries you find there, and you can also support the podcast, both by clicking on the link for Blick Art Supplies and buying your art supplies through Blick.com, the largest and oldest supplier of art supplies in the United States. You can also support the podcast in several other ways. You can do it by direct donation. Just click on the donate button at the website. You can also rate the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever and however you listen to the podcast. Leaving ratings and even leaving a little line or two in the form of a review or a comment makes a big, big difference. Like if 30 people were to rate the show on iTunes this week, well, next week the podcast would probably be featured in the noteworthy section of the iTunes page, which means the podcast reaches more listeners who may not yet have heard of the show. So help spread the word. Thanks again for your support, and thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon. Until then, have a productive week.